I actually want to begin today by reading a passage from the book of Exodus in the Old Testament. It's what's called a theophany. It's an appearance of God to Moses. And I mentioned this passage last week when I was talking about some of the various ways that God appears partially or just a little bit in the Old Testament. And then we talked about in the adult discussion group that passage, and I couldn't remember where it was. So I thought I would read it this morning to begin our discussion. It's also appropriate for my talk today. This is a passage where Moses is leading the people through the wilderness. And as happens a number of times along the way, they get restless. And they think about turning back, and Moses is unhappy that God has called him to be a leader, and God is unhappy with all of them. And actually, what happens before this passage is that the stones that the Ten Commandments are written on actually get broken. And so there's kind of a crisis moment, and Moses really is ready to quit. And Moses wants some reassurance from God. He wants, as he asked when he went up on the mountain, and so the presence of God in the burning bush, once again, he comes to God and he says, "You got to show yourself to me. I want to know who you are." And so God responds, and this is the way it goes. This is from Exodus 33. Moses says to God, "See, you have said to me, 'Bring up this people.' But you have not let me know whom you will send with me. You have said, 'I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight.' If I have found favor in your sight, show me. Show me your ways, so that I may know you and find favor in your sight. Consider, too, that this nation is your people." God said, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." And he said to him, "If your presence will not go, do not carry us from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people, unless you go with us? In this way we shall be distinct. I send your people, and from every people on the face of the earth." And God said to Moses, "I will do what you ask, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name." And Moses said, "Show me your glory, I pray." And God said, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And I will show you the mercy that is on whom I will show mercy." But God said, "You cannot see my face, for no one can see me and live." And God continued, "See, there is a place by me where you will stand on a rock. And while my glory passes by, I will put you in the cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. And then I will take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen." Now, there's a bit of humor in this passage for those who know their Hebrew. Raise your hand if you know Hebrew. I don't either. I failed Hebrew in seminary. Or for those like me who do have commentaries that are pretty good and talk about these passages. But Moses wants to see God, and God says, "Okay, I will allow you to see a part of me as I pass by." And in the Hebrew, what it says is that God passes by and allows Moses to see his behind. And everyone who reads that passage in Hebrew knows that there's some humor in this passage. But in the midst of that humor, there's also a message that runs through the Old Testament, I talked a little bit about last week, and that is that God is too much of a mystery to be named. To name God, to say that this is who is God, this is how God acts, this is what God says, in the Hebrew Scriptures, in the Old Testament, is to diminish God, to box God in. So it is best to be circumspect. to be not too confident that one can speak for or about God. And that caution is part of the message of this week's blogger. And as a reminder, what I'm doing is that I'm taking the next few weeks to read some passages from some different bloggers who are on the religious site Patheos. And they responded to a question by another blogger who said, okay, progressive Christians, you talk a lot about Jesus, you talk a lot about social justice, you talk a lot about how we should live our lives, but you don't talk a whole lot about God. Why don't you talk about God and see what happens? See what you have to say. And so I chose 5 bloggers that I'm kind of representative of the whole group. This week's blogger, his name is Jonathan. And he goes by the name of Secular Seeker. And if you read a bunch of his posts, what you will discover is that he names himself as a progressive Christian, but I don't think he's much of a church attender. And when he talks about God, and he talks about God a lot, he writes mostly from the perspective of a social scientist. He talks about other people talking about God and where that conversation about God comes from their culture, from where they were born, from the way they were raised, from the religion that they were brought up in, and how all of that has an impact on the way people view God. So what I want to do is I want to read 2 passages, or 2 portions of his passages from blogs. And one is from a while back, and then the second one is in response to the question, talk about God. The first one goes like this. One of the most basic distinctions that I make is this: talking about God as personal or God as impersonal. A personal God has a will and a plan, has knowledge, acts in the world, can hear prayers, is well like a person. An impersonal God is more like a force, a current, or a principle. For those of us who were raised in a Judeo-Christian culture, it's hard to even conceptualize this metaphor, without attributing some personal tendencies to it. But like gravity, a sacred principle, as opposed to a person, would dictate the order of the universe. Hang with me here. Getting into the specifics of each isn't my point. I'm just trying to say that this distinction exists. But it gets more complex than simply saying that Christianity has a personal God and Taoism has a sacred principle. Even within Christianity, you will find plenty of mystics and theologians who speak about God as a principle. They're not mainstream, but they're there. And the diversity of gods only spreads from here. Another classic distinction that psychology studies love to focus on. I'm losing my place here. Whether God is a personal or a principle, we shade the intentions of what God is to be either loving, nurturing, and healing, or judging, punishing, and demanding. So we make a distinction, he's saying, between some people are raised with a nurturing, loving, healing God, and other people are raised with a judging, punishing, and demanding God. There's good evidence that this distinction is largely influenced by our relationships with our early caregivers. Anna Marie Rizzuto wrote a seminal work on these relationships, and she's a psychotherapist who did write a fairly well-known book, where she talks about years and years of working with her clients as a psychotherapist and focusing in on their belief of God, listening to what they had to say about how they talked about God. And then also learning what they had to say about their early childhood and documenting how much their picture of God related to the way they were raised as children. These differences have become more rigorous in scientific studies that try to understand what a person believes about God. The classic measure was developed by R.T. Lawrence in 1997, who developed an image of a God scale measuring 6 different characteristics of God, each on a spectrum. So whatever type of God you're carrying around in your head is going to have some measure of influence on your life. And the 6 measures of influence are, number 1, providence, influence, presence, challenge, acceptance, or benevolence. It's not quite as relatable as Phillips as others, but it grasps most people's idea of the sacred. And of course, the diversity of gods doesn't end there either. J.B. Phillips outlined a variety of different types of personal gods in his book, Your God is Too Small. Has anybody ever read that book, Your God is Too Small? I'm sure some have heard of it. According to Phillips, you've got the grand old man God who's plenty wise, but maybe a little slow to keep up with modern progress. Or there's the God of absolute perfection who demands loyalty and flawless performance. Or there's the heavenly bosom God, who's a great comforter, offering infinite solace but not demanding much in return. She's quite distinct from the resident policeman God, who acts like a hall monitor in middle school. And so these are just a few illustrations from his book. At the level of diversity, the different metaphors of God are all held implicitly and unconsciously. People don't choose to believe in a heavenly bosom God. Some blend of personality, culture, experience, and necessity lead one to believe in a particular type of God. Like the difference between a loving God and a punishing God, those implicit models of God are more difficult to uproot and change than simply moving around the furniture. But he goes on, I believe that the first step to gaining fluidity between these models is to recognize which ones we are operating with or reacting against. Once you start seeing these differences, they become immediately apparent when you're listening to others. You begin to see what type of God people are carrying around with them. So while the type of God we believe in defines our spiritual path may also involve abandoning an idea of God that is no longer life-giving. That may feel like an immense loss or betrayal, but I believe it reflects a much deeper trust in whatever God there might be. That fluidity, that willingness to see what type of God we believe in, and then choose it if it's working for us, requires a trust that life and God can be bigger and deeper than it already is. I'll close with a quote from Gandhi that beautifully embodies this trust. This is him speaking. If I had to choose between truth and God, I'd choose truth. That's Gandhi's quote. Which basically is to say, as he's just been saying, that if your view of God causes you, for instance, to dismiss evolution or the ancient age of the universe or the truth about your life and what's going on in your life, then, as J.B. Phillips would say, your God is too small. And which is also to say that as we grow and learn more and hopefully change, and our picture of the truth expands, then also our view of God and our image of God changes and expands as well. But the larger point here is that in this first post is to think about how we were raised and where we were raised and what kind of an influence that has on the picture of God that we grew up with. And to realize that most people don't easily or willingly give up the God of their childhood. That God has to not work for them anymore, usually in some significant way that's causing them pain, for them to be able and willing to give it up and to find some kind of God that is bigger than what they grew up with. So this is the approach of the blogger who's known as the secular seeker. In answer to the question of this other progressive Christian to speak about God, this is what he says. He says, I heard about this Jewish guy who said God is love. It got him in a bunch of trouble with authorities. So that's probably a good place to start. After all, those moments of vulnerable openness when we encounter that we thought was other and find him or her or it to be lovable and perhaps even to love us are among the most divine experiences we can have. Think of the release and the thrill and the growth in those moments. How could that not be connected to whatever is sacred? So there's something substantive. God is love. But what about those moments that are not so Pollyannish? What about those moments of fear that sometimes override our lives? Not scary movie fear, but that insidious fear that makes us shut down. The fear that separates us from our true selves and turned loved ones into others. Are we really going to say that God is absent from those moments? If you believe in God, then that absence would be cruelty on top of abuse. So there's something else substantive. God is fear. Or imagine something so primordial and large that it could give birth to both fear and love, along with spontaneity and laughter, and even strange ferns that live off the moisture in the air. God would have to be at least that big. So there's my final substantive claim. The sacred is beyond conception. So I want to stop here. I'm going to read a little bit more of his in a moment, but I want to stop here and make a brief comment about the point that I think he's trying to make here. A couple weeks ago, after the school shooting in New England, I made a comment about this not being God's will. I think Rhonda made the same comment when she wrote to the kids on the kids page. Don't let people say that this is in any way God's will when evil like that happens. And I believe that. I believe that God is not in any way, shape, or form related to that kind of evil, or evil of any kind. But it's important to realize, I think, that that's not necessarily a traditional or a scriptural view of God. All you have to do is to think about the book of Job, if you know anything at all about the book of Job, where God is behind the horrible things that happened to Job. And when Job dares to question God about that, why do you allow these terrible things to happen to me? God doesn't say, well, it's not me, I'm not behind it. God says to Job, who are you to question me and my ways? There is this view of God in the Scriptures. And if you want to talk about God and a scriptural God, you have to reckon with evil and why it exists. Does God cause it? Does God allow it to happen? If God is all-powerful, why does God allow it to happen? Is it really God's will? Is it not God's will? And that's in the Scriptures. God either brings bad things on us to punish us, like the plagues were brought on Egypt, or God allows it to happen in order to fulfill some greater purpose, like the Son of God, Jesus, suffering horribly on a cross in order to bring about the salvation of humanity. That's discussion of why these things happen and where is God in all the midst of this is a huge part of God talk. And I think that's why many progressive Christians struggle with God talk. That's why I struggle with God talk. Because I don't believe this. I don't believe what those scriptures say about God. And so some take the route of the secular seeker, who goes on to say this. And by definition, that's where my imagination fails me. So I'm going to stop talking theology and ask the real question. Is an unwillingness to make definitive claims about God really a problem? In fact, haven't those claims caused plenty of problems already? Perhaps dwelling in ambiguity doesn't enliven the masses the same way self-assured, confident statements do. But is the goal to enliven the masses, or is the goal to model a proper response to whatever is true and beautiful and good in our life? I'd rather choose the latter and trust than quicken with a false idol. Besides, the people who want the comfort and surety of definitive statements about God, they're already going to where those statements are a dime a dozen. It's not that the rest of us want ambiguity. We want the truth. We accept ambiguity because of the movement it inspires. We accept the ineffability of the sacred because then we are drawn to seek it. Quite frankly, we accept the unknown because it's a lot more fun than dwelling in the comfort zone built from sure, definitive statements about God. And he goes on to say, to close, what's wrong with the progressive church isn't a lack of God talk. What's wrong with the progressive church is the inability or unwillingness to guide us on that journey. The church is unwilling because it's more concerned with its own perpetuity. The spiritual journey inherently transcends these domestic boundaries and is therefore unsafe for an institution upheld by doctrine and belief. So, he says, it's just too easy to say that this is the will of God. My screen went blank right at that moment. It's too easy to say that this is the will of God or this is not God's will. And in the progressive church, that's not our place. It's better to let God be a mystery. And to talk about all the ways that we live in the midst of mystery, and that as we are seeking the truth, that for every piece of knowledge that we gain, we don't come closer to knowing everything, but more mystery unfolds before us. And there in that mystery is where we want to be. And there in that mystery, if you want to talk about God, that's where God is.